Spitfire Audio has finally come out with core editions of their Abbey Road Orchestra series percussion libraries. So today we're going to take a look at it, see if it's worth the money or if it's not. Let's get started. Okay, so if you take a look at the Abbey Road Orchestra page on Spitfire's website, you'll see that part of the bundles joining symphonic strings is the Percussion Core libraries as a bundle, as well as the professional libraries as a bundle together. So if you've been interested in those libraries, you don't have to buy one individually. You can save a little bit of money and get them all in a bundle, which is pretty cool. Scrolling down, you can get each library in a core version as well. That's low percussion, high percussion, and metal percussion. As of right now, there's no tuned percussion library or a timpani library. These are all strictly untuned percussion instruments. By the way, I really like the photography that they've gone with for these libraries. They've changed the branding for these libraries a little bit back and forth, but I really like the cool, dramatic, contrasty photography for each of these libraries. Okay, so if you don't know, I've been making reviews for every single one of these products that's on this page. Here on the channel, I have all those reviews in their own dedicated playlist on this channel, the Abbey Road Orchestra Spitfire Audio Reviews. And I started off with low percussion professional, which was the first library in this range to come out. Got my hands on that library, made a review, and then ever since then, I've been able to get each subsequent library to review on the channel. So I reviewed the low percussion, high percussion, metal percussion libraries in detail in those videos. And if you're curious about each one more specifically, go and check out those videos. This isn't going to be a walkthrough of all three of these libraries. I go into much more detail in those previous videos. So let's briefly talk about the difference between the Percussion Core and professional libraries. If you're familiar with the professional libraries, low percussion, for example, is just a range of low-end percussion instruments that were recorded at Abbey Road Studio 1 in London. So this involves mostly bass drums, a few toms, stuff like that, but not much else. However, they've sampled each of these drums in really great detail. So they've recorded several beaters, several mallets, several sticks per instrument, including right hand strikes and left hand strikes. And this is true for all the instruments in high percussion and metal percussion as well. The professional versions of the library have 16 mixes and microphone signals that you can play with. The core version gives you access to none of those. The default sound is the Mix 1 sound, which we'll talk about to see whether this fits for you or if it doesn't. Otherwise, all the instruments, beaters, right-left mappings, all that stuff is the same with both. By the way, I've been trying to make this video for like a week, but I've been sick. I'm still recovering, so bear with me. Okay, so firstly, let's talk about the price. When the original libraries first came out, there was a lot of talk over their price because you only would get a third or a fourth or a fifth of the percussion section, but for $450. And that was true for the first three libraries. These are just $99 each, which right off the bat, I think is really great. Even still, you can get all three libraries in the Percussion Core bundle right now for $199, which just based off that and knowing these libraries as well as I do, I would absolutely go for these. However, this may or may not be something you pick up solely based on that because of maybe a couple reasons. So what you get with the bundle is the first three libraries: low percussion, high percussion, metal percussion. You also get a MIDI pack of a few rudiments for the snare drum, which is really interesting and sort of unexpected. And this also got me thinking though, there are some specific instruments on high percussion that would be really helpful to have pre-made MIDI for those. So I've gone ahead and made a MIDI pack for Abbey Road Orchestra high percussion. More on that a little later. Okay, so let's head over to my default template. This is my ultimate template, which you can get for yourself at ernestocomposer.com/templates if that interests you. I've integrated all three of the libraries into my template. They're my default orchestral percussion sounds. So I have them here under the orc perc track for these three folders: metal, mid, high, and low. Let's go into low. That was the first library to come out. I have each instrument split out into its own track, and then the all-in-one patches, which gives you all the sticks and all the beaters across the entire keyboard. loaded up for each of them, as well as the mid-high instruments, which I love the variety of instruments that they give, and the metal instruments. Again, tons of really cool and really well recorded sounds across all of these. So the conclusion I came to with the original professional libraries was that low percussion is a really, really fantastic library and is actually the one that I recommend to most people. Second to that is high percussion because of the variety of instruments and how well they sound as well. And then thirdly is metal percussion. Not because it isn't good, it is very good. It's just most people already have a lot of the metal percussion sounds anyway, so it may not be worth double dipping with those even if they match the room sound. There are several unique things in the metal percussion libraries, like the oil drum is just a big oil drum that's been recorded and hit in several ways. Trash cans, there's a giant crasher, spring coil, scaffolds, chains, and stuff like that. These are all instruments that I didn't think I would use, but I actually used them on a short film that I scored over the summer. So here's what I'll do. I'll show you these instruments together and then show you these instruments and how they fit in context with each other. So the reason I mentioned that this may not be something that you will go for is if you have all of these instruments already. The microphone mix is very good. However, if you're going to use these instruments in isolation, the room sound might be too overwhelming compared to the percussion sound. If, however, you have, say, the core version of the symphonic strings library or a couple of the woodwinds that have come out so far, these will tie in really, really well with those. But I think that core sound, the Mix 1 sound, is best served in context with other instruments. Okay, so this is a project I made actually a couple years ago now when the first three libraries were released, because I wanted to get a sense for how best I could fit them into my template. The way I have my template set up, each section of the orchestra goes through a little bit of processing to sort of hype up the sound, have my own signature sound. On the percussion stems, there's a little bit of a tail reverb, a little bit of a Pultec style EQ, and a little bit of compression on there. I believe most of these are using Mix 1, which is what you would get in Core, but let me make sure that each one of them is in Mix 1 so that you get a pretty good representation of the kind of sound that you'll get when you're using Core. Like I mentioned, Abbey Road Orchestra is a very big room. It's a very wet sound that you'll get out of the box. But when you hear some of those scores recorded at Abbey Road and you hear that percussion, it sounds larger than life. It sounds awesome. What comes to mind is the prequel Star Wars films, like maybe Revenge of the Sith. There's a lot of percussion in those scores, and they sound really, really great in context with the entire orchestra. Of course, I think of Avengers, Infinity War, Avengers Endgame by Alan Silvestri. A lot of percussion in those, sound great recorded at Abbey Road. Lord of the Rings, stuff like that sticks out to me in my head with a really, really great drum sound. Like I think it complements a lot. Okay, everything's loaded up. Here's what this sounds like. Okay, so of course that's going through my processing, so there's a little bit more reverb. You hear an EQ in there that isn't what this sounds like out of the box. However, you can still tell the sound of the room and the tone of the instruments recorded in the room. Something I emphasized in those first 3 reviews for the original libraries was I adored how deeply sampled these libraries. And something I said in the low percussion video was that this isn't a lot of breadth, like it's not a huge array of instruments per library, but there's a lot of depth into each instrument that's been recorded. Something that I loved about metal percussion was that there were 3 different styles of crash cymbals recorded. Each was a different style: French cymbals, German cymbals, and Viennese cymbals. If you want to hear what the difference is between those 3 cymbals, go and check out the metal percussion review. But to a percussionist like me, I was classically trained. I studied percussion at university with really world-class percussionists at the University of North Texas, which is where I graduated from. And I was just delighted to see 3 different triangles recorded, because as a percussionist, I would select a different kind of triangle, or a composer would ask for a different kind of triangle depending on the thing. And I still will reach for one triangle or the other depending on what I need when I'm using these libraries. There are 4 different kinds of snare drums: a typical orchestral snare drum, 2 piccolo snare drums, which are much higher pitched, and then a field drum, which is very lower pitched, but still has snares, all of that stuff. I can barely think of instruments that don't appear that I would like to appear. However, I do have a couple. I love a shekere in the high percussion library. That's like a gourd shaped instrument with like beads around it. It's actually pretty common in Latin music. They have a bunch of Latin instruments in here, along with shakers, the cabasa, a kashishi, maracas, guiros, and a guira. A shekere would fit really well in there. Also would love a rivet or sizzle cymbal of some kind. That's a cymbal with like these little metal either beads on top or rivets that have been drilled into a cymbal. So when you strike it, the metal rubs against the cymbal and it sounds like it's sizzling. This is a really cool effect that I don't see in here. But still, I'm very happy with what these sound. Okay, so let me show you this library a little bit more in context, and let me pull up the cue that I was talking about that I scored using a lot of these instruments. So the context for that is this film that I worked on has no dialogue throughout, and it's very, very music heavy. And there's a scene where our character goes down into like a dark tunnel, and she meets a bunch of really scary mimes who confront the camera and are doing really spooky stuff. But since there are no sound effects or dialogue or anything like that, I represented a lot of their actions that they're doing with musical instruments instead of with sound effects, for example. So I utilized a bunch of instruments that I didn't think I would use, that were like a little weird, a little off kilter. I needed something that sounded like just kind of dirty, scary a little bit, underground type of feel. So the metal percussion instruments were just super helpful in something like this. Let me pull up the cue. I won't show you the picture, but I'll at least play you what I was doing. And I pair these percussion instruments with BBC Symphony Orchestra orchestral sounds, which is what I had at the time. Okay, so here's the cue. As I mentioned, the orchestral sounds are BBC Symphony Orchestra, but all this special percussion stuff is Abbey Road Orchestra. So here's what it sounds like. So all the percussion you heard sort of like out of time or seemingly at random moments, that's supposed to represent whatever a mime is like doing in real time in context of the music that's driving the scene forward. All of the sound effects are just performed by percussion instruments. So there were things like using a brush on the oil drum to represent a mime going like this, like shaking a little box or something. Or there's a point where a mime's flicking a lighter on, so I use a ratchet and do a couple just turns, little clicks of a ratchet, which is in the high percussion library, to have that stuff. So those are moments where instruments I didn't think I would use, the oil drum, trash cans. I ended up liking the plastics, like the plastic bins and stuff that they recorded for the high percussion library a lot. I think they sound really, really cool, especially like paired with a snare drum or something like that. Okay, I briefly mentioned that the core libraries come with this like MIDI pack of rudiments for the snare drum, which as I was thinking about it, I thought that's actually a really cool idea because the way these libraries are split out, they're quite detailed. So detailed, in fact, that there are specific techniques in some of the instruments that may only be familiar to people who play that instrument, and a composer or producer who isn't a percussionist, they might play something else really well, isn't a percussionist, sees these and they don't just know what to do with them, much less even know what they are. So if you don't know a rudiment, this is how I describe it to my 6th grade students. A rudiment is sort of like a bit of vocabulary in drumming that when you learn makes up greater, in this case, snare drum writing. So when you come across rudiments like a flam or a ruff or a paradiddle, you study them on their own, and then when they appear in music, you know how to play them. So it's either like a special technique that you play or just a pattern, sticking pattern or accent pattern or something like that. So when you get the library under the Abbey Road Orchestra folder, there's a new folder called MIDI. If you go into that, Spitfire Audio Drum Rudiments, you'll find different kinds of diddles, drags, flams, rolls in different varieties. So all you have to do is go in and find something. They have them in different versions. So this is a double paradiddle, paradiddle diddles, single paradiddles, several kinds of drag rudiments, flams, and rolls. This seems like almost all 40 typical drum rudiments, which you can look up online to find the 40 classic rudiments. And there are more that you can combine rudiments to make hybrid rudiments. And these are the 40 classic rudiments that they've thrown in here that are specially mapped for the snare drum, piccolo snare drum, fiddle drum, all those snare instruments in Abbey Road Orchestra high percussion. That got me thinking that there are a couple of instruments in high percussion that are specific like that break down different techniques for the drum and can be put together to create an authentic sounding recording. So for many of the Latin instruments, I went ahead and created a MIDI pack that goes through a bunch of classic rhythms and patterns on the conga drums, bongos, on claves and timbales, and put that together and threw it up on my website. So if you're interested in the Abbey Road Orchestra Latin percussion MIDI pack that I made, check that out at ernestocomposer.com/templates as well. Just to show you what I mean, like let me show you an example of the congas playing with the MIDI that I've come up with. So when you put a file in, this is the basic conga rhythm in eighth notes. So it utilizes every technique that's written and is split out in these samples, but laid out in an authentic way. So you don't need to know the exact way to perform a tumbao rhythm on the congas, which is something you hear all the time when you hear congas, but only something a trained percussionist, whether they've been trained classically or not, would know. So I put these together for just these instruments for now and put them up on my website for a few bucks. So if that interests you, then check it out. Okay, now this brings me into my final thoughts on who this is for, because for these instruments and the detail that they've been recorded at, I think these prices are killer for what you get. Now again, it's only one mix, and that mix is a very, very roomy sound, which is fantastic in context with the rest of the orchestra. Something I loved about the professional version of these was that all the mic instruments, Abbey Road Studio 1 is such a huge room. However, if you play your cards right and you just have some of the pop close mic on, it sounds almost like it's been recorded in a tight studio or in a tight room. I usually like to add a little bit of section overhead to give it a little bit of space. And this sound is so great that in my perc and drums folder down here, which is percussion instruments not in an orchestral context, under drums, for example, I have the Abbey Road Orchestra drums, but with the pop close mix up, because it just sounds like a small studio rather than a huge orchestral room. And I've used these several times in context. Let me show you something that I wrote. This is a long time ago. This was a long time ago when this library came out. Here's something that I made with Abbey Road Orchestra percussion. So that's entirely sampled except for the claps. The claps I recorded myself and then added a little reverb and panned them a little bit. I did multiple takes and layered them all together. The rest of the instruments are all Abbey Road Orchestra. I have some reverb on there, but like the sound of the congas sounds just so fantastic. I have the kashishi go in there. That's the shaker sound you hear at the beginning. And then that bass drum that comes in, that's the sordo from the low percussion library, which is a Brazilian drum. Just like give it a little bit more of a oomph to it. But anyway, that to me is one of the biggest advantages of going for the pro tier. There's also Mix 2, which I do have up on some of my default instruments like the snare drum, because that's just a closer, more detailed sound, still in orchestral context, but if something's more complicated, I don't want it to get muddied up by the sound of the room. I want to zoom in a little bit closer on that aperture. So if you have use for the core percussion libraries because you have use for all those detailed sounds, which they are fantastic, in an orchestral context, then this is what I would do. I would get the core bundle. If you already have Abbey Road Orchestra products, you get a discount on other ARO products in the same range. So it could be even cheaper depending on what you already have. Then, as it becomes necessary or as you want, you can get the pro versions. So you can get the pro bundle, which would be much cheaper when you already have the core bundle anyway. But if you were to get one at a time, this is the order I would do it in. I would get high percussion first because of these instruments that I pointed out. They just are so useful to like zoom in right up into the instrument and make it sound like a studio recording, but still with all the same detail and great performance. And then I would go metal percussion after that, because there are other instruments that are useful in that context as well, like the cymbals, triangles, that small triangle I use all the time, really close up, to match like other non-orchestral contexts. The tambourine, stuff like that, super useful to have in metal percussion. And then low percussion after that, just so like maybe if you want more detail in the taikos or in the dragon drums, which are really cool, which I like to use, then I would do it like that. But I think those are just a little less useful to have zoomed in than the high percussion and metal percussion libraries, if you get what I'm saying here. Okay, so those are my thoughts on Abbey Road Orchestra Percussion Core. I'm glad that these instruments are now in bundles. I'm eagerly awaiting the tuned percussion library whenever that may appear. I'm just hoping for a slew of tuned percussion instruments. Not just, I'm still using BBC Symphony Orchestra, which only has these instruments plus the timpani. I'd like these plus tons more. Like anything you can think of, like a berimbulum or unklung, or all kinds of tuned percussion instruments from around the world would be awesome to have in here. Not to mention these basic instruments recorded in with various different mallets and stuff like that that someone like me would definitely utilize. But I would absolutely recommend this library. I could have just said that this entire time, but I wanted to explain why and the path to upgrading if that interests you further down the line as well. All right, thanks so much for watching. I really appreciate it. I'll see you for the next one, and until then, take care.